Every week, I look through the Steam store looking for something new and interesting to review. I look through the games that are $5 or less looking for something that's eye-catching and appealing. But I began to notice something pretty immediately when I started doing these reviews a couple months ago. There are two types of games that normally flood the $5 section: horror games and anime titty games. When I started doing these reviews, I began to wonder why there were so many cheap horror games. Not really the anime games, because tits sell! So I decided to talk about this topic because it's quite interesting, and also my last video got yeeted into the nether. So let's get into why there are so many cheap horror games.
They also did not hear the people in the control room.
I think to answer this question, let's talk about what makes horror games good. Horror games are interesting because their goal is actually pretty easy to understand: terrify the player. But the goal is easier said than done. You can make a game full of jump scares and call it a day, but what makes a horror game memorable? First, you have to set atmosphere. There are a ton of examples, but let's talk about a game that's pretty cheap. No One Lives Under the Lighthouse. From the start of the game, the mood is already ominous and scary. We're left all alone on an island in the middle of the ocean, having to take care of a lonely lighthouse. The mood is already eerie, and the story keeps the player interested, as they begin to wonder what exactly is going on with this island. Second is the story. Why is the player here, and what is unsettling about the situation the player is in? Going back to our example, we already know the why, but not the what. We find out that the previous keeper went missing without a trace. This is good because the player knows that something isn't right here. We can then begin to mess with the player and make them afraid of the island. Last but certainly not least is the fear, the horror, the spookiness. The Jeepers Creepers, where'd you get those peepers? Ha! You can't have a horror game without the thing that's horrifying. Lighthouse does a great job of building suspense and tension as it climbs to its big monster reveal. This doesn't always have to be a monster though. Some games like Devotion are scary without even having a monster, instead relying on the fear of human nature. So we know how to make a good horror game, but we still haven't answered the question of why there are so many cheap horror games. The thing is, what makes a good horror game is actually achievable with a low budget. An important thing is that player objective for small horror games is pretty simple compared to something like an action-adventure game. For example, the action-adventure plot would be: you play as Loinky, and you must stop Kirby Dwarf from using the Buster Sword of Evil that will plunge the world into 1,000 years of darkness. For a horror game, you don't really need a complicated plot. It can be as simple as you work the night shift at a convenience store and something creepy is going on. If that sounds doable, it's because someone actually did make a game out of it. The thing is, that game only really needed one environment and achieved the feeling of dread and eeriness. You can make one area, and as long as you keep it interesting, you can make a whole game around it. And the environment you make doesn't have to be anything special. If you're creative enough, you can make an ordinary place scary because we're supposed to feel safe at home or work. But in a horror game, we feel trapped in that environment because it's supposed to feel safe. A free horror game that I know you've heard about because MatPat's gonna beat that dead horse till the end of days: Five Nights at Freddy's. This game achieves that feeling of trapped terror with its limited resources, and through good use of sound design and scary visuals brings a really tense horror experience. Instead of you exploring the haunted Chuck E. Cheese-esque location, you stay at one place because the game makes it very clear that you're already in the quote-unquote safest place. Another free horror game that took the internet by storm is Slender Man. The environment in Slender Man isn't anything special, but the Slender Man himself sets the mood even though he really doesn't look that scary. The true horror comes from the fact that he's following you at almost every moment. You feel trapped and terrified, looking behind you at every moment, waiting to find him. This sets the player on a frantic pace to try and find every page before he jumps out and scares you. At their core, both these games are really simple, but through good use of game design, they're quite scary and bring a tense horror experience. There are also a lot of cheap, good 2D horror games like Lone Survivor and Distraint. These games reuse areas and assets, but both these games don't have a whole lot of areas in general and don't need a robust world. Thanks to their storytelling and visuals, they keep the player on edge and engaged in the story. Hell, sometimes you only need 1 or 2 bits of graphics and you can make it work. Another game, World of Horror, has some great horror visuals that are super detailed and they only use 2-bit graphics. Another game, The Horror of House Salazar, uses 1-bit graphics along with point-and-click gameplay to bring a tense experience. Horror game visuals in general don't need to look crisp and beautiful. You're trying to creep out the player, not win a beauty pageant. I feel like that is a big reason why people still have nostalgia for the foggy environments of Silent Hill. The limited and imperfect visuals actually added a lot to the atmosphere of that game. And I think without the fog, the town of Silent Hill wouldn't feel as off-putting. Speaking of Silent Hill, I think it's a good time to talk about PT. PT will go down as one of the most terrifying game experiences, and it was just a demo. That shit still haunts me for 2 main reasons. 1, it was super fucking scary, and 2, that shit's never gonna come out.
Ah, the memories with this one. I still have the nightmares.
The reason though why I'm talking about PT is what these cheap horror games are trying to achieve: a short but memorable horror experience that uses its environment, storytelling, and chilling visuals. Now they don't have people like Junji Ito, Guillermo del Toro, and Kojima working on them, but these small developers aren't trying to make them next PT, because that's damn near impossible. They're trying to do a lot with a little, and horror games are great for that. The stuff you need for a horror game is much less compared to most genres. PT is one of the scariest things I've ever played, and it's just about going through a hallway. On the flip side, making a horror game scary and memorable can be pretty difficult. A lot of these cheap horror games fail at what we discussed because they feel very cookie cutter. Instead of using an atmosphere to creep out the player, they're just filled with jump scares, making the horror game forgettable. Instead of having an interesting environment, they have one really long, boring maze-like environment that just wastes the player's time. And they have these awful, boring monsters that aren't designed well, and they just frustrate the player. The funny thing is, you can make a scary and fun game that is just mazes and jump scares. Look at Spooky Jumpscare Mansion. It takes those bad tropes and makes a fun, scary game that brings also an interesting story to the mansion.
It's a goddamn chair route!
I think at the end of the day, horror games are very versatile, letting someone make a tailored and freeform experience. You don't need to balance classes or items, you don't need to make a robust world, you don't need to make an in-depth battle system. The downside to that versatility is that it leads to an oversaturation of games that are clones, badly written, and just terribly designed. These games rely on just getting a generic jump scare reaction out of the player, instead of bringing a chilling, memorable experience, but most of the time they're just pretty forgettable. To make a good, cheap horror game, you have to do a lot with a little, but to make it memorable, you need to be creative and tailor a terrifying experience with the limited tools and resources that you have.